Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I do hope that you're doing exceedingly well, and I want to send you loads and loads of love. And I hope that you're having a super day. But don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is you drink, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Pippa, and I grew up in Oregon in a very picturesque and exquisite part of the world, on 70 acres of land in the 90s. Our enchantingly nostalgic-looking home has been in the family line since the 1800s and has been fortunately passed down from one generation to the next. Our exquisite property boasts 3 beautiful ponds and a delightful creek surrounded by majestic, tall, towering silver fir, grand fir, beech, pine, sequoia and maple trees that create an extensive wooded area on our land, forming a natural forest which is teeming with an indigenous abundant wildlife such as the mule deer and black-tailed deer, squirrels, raccoons, and the list invariably goes on and on. We grow about 20 acres of Christmas trees on our land, along with some tillable timber. Our ancestral home is situated where the original homestead once was, and was renovated and restored to its original pristine condition in 1995, as my father is passionate about the historical heritage and was determined to preserve the traditional historic integrity of our home. Our double-storey symmetrical cream home is highlighted by striking vintage red accents which are seen in wooden-framed square windows, covered porches and exterior doors, providing a vibrant contrast to the creamy white exterior walls. When you approach our family property, you will come to a very stylized black wrought iron gate that is situated on the side of the long dirt road. If you were to ring the intercom system and someone answers for you from inside the house and opens the gate for you, you literally drive down this prepossessing long spirally road that meanders through the valley and is densely shaded by large, graceful, mature oaks. Finally, the road turns to a brick and cobblestone semicircular driveway, and you will have arrived at the homestead. The views from our elegant porch overlook stunning panoramic views directly over one of our ponds, and it is wonderful on a summer's evening to observe the deer congregating at the water to drink. Our conspicuous home is airy, spacious, and a great deal larger on the interior than you would expect, and the snazzy wooden railings and beams in our home come from our own harvested timber from the sequoia and the pine and maple trees on our land, which is something my father boasts about all the time, because it's exceedingly special to have the wooden access in your home come from your own timber that was grown on your own property. I live in a charming abode with my father, mother, and brother Jonathan. The story about how my parents actually met is incredibly romantic. My mother was actually a Vegas showgirl, and her dominant boyfriend at the time was a violent thug who would beat her up if he thought she was looking at someone in the wrong way, as he was incredibly possessive, volatile, and exceedingly jealous, and when he got angry, his unquenchable fury would cause him to erupt like a major volcano, so that he would beat the life out of you with little provocation. There were rumours that abounded around Vegas that a couple of missing Vegas girls may have met their untimely demise on the receiving end of his weighty fists, but if that were indeed the case, he had managed to conceal his tracks superbly, because no evidence was ever uncovered or found against him to arrest him for these preposterous crimes, nor was there anything ever proved, because he was masterful at covering his tracks. I think my mother was naturally drawn to roughneck men who were big bullies because she'd grown up in a very dysfunctional home where her mother was beaten up very regularly by her loutish father, and growing up that was her normal. I think she expected to be beaten up by ruffian men because she had such a dreadful low self-esteem and had no sense of self-worth whatsoever, which was so pitiful, and so it would seem perfectly natural that the attention she invariably received dancing on the strip had elevated her self-assurance ever so slightly, and she was indeed a very talented and beautiful dancer. One day when my father was in Vegas, he found this poor bedraggled woman lying battered, bruised, and half dead in the bushes. I gather she'd been beaten so badly by her suspicious boyfriend Jed that she was virtually unrecognizable. My father immediately called an ambulance as he realised how serious the situation was, and the doctors discovered that her pelvis had been shattered in 4 places and she had to undergo numerous critical operations, but her career as a dancing showgirl was well and truly over. The doctor said it was an absolute miracle that she was in fact alive. One of her legs was slightly shorter than the other due to the extensive surgery, although thankfully it wasn't noticeable. However, every dancer knows that your legs need to be in perfect alignment to be a great dancer. My mother refused to file any charges against Jed because she knew he had a macho gangster-like friends that were only too eager to do his bidding at any of his requests. So if Jed was indeed imprisoned on her account, my mother was pretty certain that she would mysteriously go missing, never to be seen or heard from again. My father visited my mother regularly as she recuperated in a Vegas hospital. He was in Vegas for that month, drafting some architectural designs for a client. He encouraged my mother to stay at his homestead in Oregon to recuperate because he saw her as a lost soul that needed a helping hand and a friendly face to help her along with her recovery. My mother, who was not financially secure at the time, did not have many choices unless she wanted to return to her horrible boyfriend Jed, and that was not a conceivable option for her. So she accepted my dad's invitation very gladly and graciously, and the rest is history, because ultimately they fell in love. My father was able to enable my mother to gain her self-worth and help her to become a confident, gregarious, lovable and fun-loving person. Both my parents call their love story serendipity because it was such a magical romance, in the modern sense of the word, that just simply was meant to be. Growing up, Jonathan and I would pretty much play together all the time as kids, and with so much land we would go exploring everywhere and anywhere. We adored riding mountain bikes across the valley and exploring the woods as well as playing by the magnificent creek. I was a passionate animal lover, and over the years I would rescue animals that needed help, like little fledglings from a nest or a deer that had got caught up in barbed wire, and I would nurse those creatures back to health, sometimes with startling success, which is probably why it's not a surprise that I became a wildlife vet in later years, because I love animals so very much, and I'm passionate about working with wild animals. One day my brother and I were playing happily in the woods, when quite by accident we observed that there was a single-man tent hitched in the woods in our land, and it looked ominously like someone was camping in our woods, that they had not done a great job in concealing their presence from us. There was a sign of a fire pit, pots and pans, and there were binoculars, cameras, books, and all kinds of things stacked neatly in the tent, in neat piles. It was all decidedly odd, because our land was indeed private property, and no one should be camping out here in our woods. We began to snoop around and investigate the tent, and we found tons of pictures of my mother when she was actually a young showgirl, and then there were recent photographs taken of her only days ago on our homestead, when she was actually feeding the chickens outside, or digging in the vegetable bed planting seedlings, and even pictures of her at the local town having coffee and cake with friends. I knew at once that something was very clearly wrong, and someone or someone was spying and stalking her, and it was an airy, terrifying feeling. Worse still, there were pictures of my father, and an angry pen had been scrawled across my dad's pictures with the word dead, and there was a diary with crazy writing scrawled all over it that looked like it had been written by a manic person who was half crazed. However, I did notice that the diary had also recorded the times that my dad was in and out of his offices on our land, and I noticed that the 4 p.m. timeline was circled in a red fountain pen, which looked very nefarious to me. I certainly uncovered enough evidence to know that this man clearly intended to kill my dad and kidnap my mother. I knew at once that whoever he was, and I believed he was Jed, whom had found my mother, possibly after years of searching for her, and had possibly procured the help of a private detective to find her. Over the years my mother had been terrified of Jed actually finding her, and was still having nightmares about him all these years later, but my father felt sure that Jed would just move on with his life. Little did my dad realize the power of Jed's manic, insatiable obsession for my mother. As I was reflecting over the horrifying revelation of Jed's sudden presence on our land, I knew I needed to inform my dad at once, But before I could race back to our house to warn my father about Jed's appearance, we heard a noise very suddenly that stopped us dead in our tracks. My brother and I distinctly heard the crunching of leaves under feet, and we could tell that this was Jed coming back to his tent, so we ran and hid behind a large sequoia tree. As he approached, we got a very good look at him. He was very tall, handsome and strong-looking, but there was something menacing and nefarious about his demeanour. We watched him pacing up and down like a manic man who had something very serious on his mind, which was very troubling because it looked like he was psyching himself up to do something quite terrible, and I was almost certain he was going to kill our father, and I had no doubt in my mind about that. "What's he doing?" I whispered to Jonathan. "He's going into the tent," said my brother. Suddenly Jed was standing outside the tent with a very determined look on his face, and we watched him load his rifle with bullets. It did not look at all good. I realized that Jed had been watching our house and he knew the routines of our household, and I glanced at my watch, and it was 5 to 4, and that was the time that my father was about to leave the outbuilding where he did his architectural designs for his clients, to return to the house for a cup of coffee and my mother's delicious homemade pumpkin pie. He was about to leave the outhouse, and Jed was now pointing his gun through the trees to aim at my dad as he walked past. That simply could not happen. Jed had to be stopped, I thought, and he had to be stopped now. "No!" I shrieked, darting out of my hiding place and lunging towards Jed, who in seconds beat me up violently with the back of his rifle, without even hesitating, and I was only 15 at the time. "You bloody stupid kids," he protested. "I might have known you'd get in my way." He started waving his gun at me and demanding I stayed very still or else I was dead. "I know you're trying to kill my dad," I protested. "I know exactly who and what you are, and my mother is well rid of you, and she would never ever want you back under any circumstances. Let me tell you that now." "We'll see about that," he said, spitting at me. "I think once your father is out of the way, your mother will have a change of heart. She was always very weak-willed," he drawled. Suddenly Jonathan ran out of his hiding place and proceeded to pounce on Jed. But Jed was so much stronger and more powerful than my brother, and was pinning and forcing him down, beating him violently with his fists, and things were beginning to look terrifying because Jed was quite simply beating and pounding my brother to death. And in minutes it would be all over for my brother because the fighting was that brutal. I began to scream at the top of my lungs. "Please don't hurt him! Please don't! I beg you! Stop! Please! Please won't you stop? Please, you're killing my brother!" Suddenly there was this monstrous growl, unlike anything I've ever heard before in my entire life. It was so terrifying that it literally caused the ground to shake, and we could hear someone or something coming, and it was thundering towards us, and whatever this thing was, it had to be colossal in size, because it sounded like a rhino. Jed stopped beating my brother for a second, and I heard him say, "What the heck?" The next thing I knew was that standing before us was this massive, colossal, huge bipedal humanoid ape, covered from head to toe with long, flowing, dark brown hair. And you could tell that this critter was incandescent with fury and rage, and his intense anger was directed towards Jed. There was no doubt about that. Jed looked utterly petrified and began to shake as the creature curled its lips back and growled at him furiously with an aggressive, pugnacious anger. Jed was no match for this dangerous apex predator, and he absolutely knew it. Jed looked pathetic, scrawny and weak next to this King Kong-like creature. Jed was shaking so violently that he was barely coping to aim his rifle at the critter, and try as he might, he just fumbled and failed to get it to focus. Before he got a chance to offload his bullets into the creature pounced on top of him with such a brute force that Jed's body was flattened out under the colossal weight of this creature, pressing down upon him. Imagine a 1,000-pound concrete block pinning you down. It was just like that. At first Jed screamed, but finally the screams dissipated, and he became totally soundless. I think the colossal and elephantine weight of this titanic creature, squeezing the life out of his body, had ultimately suffocated him to death. and he lay on the ground, limp and lifeless, like a rag doll. Suddenly I became very afraid that this mysterious creature would turn his violence upon us, but it did not. In fact, the creature checked that Jed was dead by examining the body very carefully with a push of his massive feet, and finally it seemed he was satisfied that Jed was deceased. And then the creature looked up at us with the sparkling brown eyes that were so incredibly beautiful and so lively and warm. And he looked at us as if he was familiar with us, almost as if he knew us. He made a few chattering sounds as if to say, "I do hope you're all right." And then we watched him glide away with a seamless fluidity and grace, like such that we have never ever seen. "What on earth was that?" said Jonathan in amazement. "That creature saved my life. A few more punches from Jed, and I'd be pushing up the daisies by now." My brother and I embraced in a very long emotional hug, and we both literally sobbed and sobbed because we were so incredibly grateful to be alive, and we knew how close we came to losing our lives, and we were also so happy that Jed was finally dead. "We better call the police," I said, "and tell them absolutely everything that's happened." "I think not," said my brother. "I have a better plan. We leave Jed's body to get scavenged by the coyotes until only his body bones remain. Then I'll place the bones in an area where they can be discovered by the police with no connection to us whatsoever. Mum has been through so much in her life. The last thing she needs is to know that Jed came after her to kill Dad and to kidnap her. I think it will totally destroy and devastate her, and we don't need our Dad to know that he came so close to losing his life either. Let them remain happily oblivious to what transpired today. Why should they have to deal with all this emotional drama and hurt? It literally could destroy both Mum and really upset Dad. We don't need to do this to them." I realised my brother was absolutely right, as my mother was still deeply traumatised by her past. It would be like opening up a festering old wound all over again. Jonathan and I burnt the tent, the diary, photographs, and we took all the possessions to the dumpster. Over the years we thought a great deal about the colossal creature that we encountered in the woods, whom we did get to see a couple more times on our land, but only very briefly, because he was gone quite fast. But I will say this, he acknowledged us, he most certainly did. The creature we encountered was very, very huge indeed. I would say he was at least 10 foot, 1,000 pounds and 4 foot wide, with very long, overlong arms that fell below his knees. We also noticed he was athletic, strong, agile, powerful and burly, and I think he would have no problems at all in lifting up a car at the drop of a hat. That's how powerful and strong he was. I am certain that creature, which I now know was in fact a Bigfoot, is familiar with our comings and goings, and has observed Jonathan and I playing in the woods together as children. Perhaps he observed us throughout our entire childhood. I think over the years he had become almost like an invisible guardian angel, always watching us in the shadows of the forest, where he remained ever watchful, attentive, but always elusive. I believe he was looking over us because he was very protective over us, ensuring that we were indeed rescued from Jed. I believe when he heard my screams, he came sprinting to my defence and instantly killed Jed with the loyalty of a true friend who has your very best interests at heart. It was not long before Jed's body was indeed a pile of bones and lay scattered all over the forest floor, and was invariably soon eaten by all the scavengers. We had to literally conduct a search to find the bones because they were everywhere, and we collected them together in a huge heap. My brother and I went to drop them off in an area which was frequented by regular dog walkers, and we left all his details, such as his ID, so that he could easily be identified. The police found his body, and it was believed that he had been mauled by a wild animal, which is close to the truth as you can get, I imagine. The trouble with him is that he did associate himself with some rather unsavoury characters, so I'm almost certain people did wonder if there were more nefarious reasons around his death. Once my mother learnt about Jed's death, she was so utterly relieved, and her fears about him finding her finally dissipated, and if it were at all possible, she blossomed and became even more happy. My mother and father took up flamenco dancing together and had the time of their lives. I am glad they never heard the commotion on our land that day, and I am certain we did the right thing keeping my parents in the dark about Jed. I know without a doubt Jonathan's was rescued by Bigfoot that day, and I am eternally grateful that his life was saved. As for Jed, as far as I'm concerned, he deserved everything he got. It's as simple as that, as mercenary and as calculating as that may sound. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I just want to say thank you so very much for that absolutely extraordinary story. And wow, what an extraordinary Bigfoot you had on your land, rescuing you from the attacks of a very aggressive man. Until next time, goodbye and good night.